Hi folks, I'm Spence, and on today's episode of Cult Mania, we are going to be taking a look at the Cornish horrors of Mark Jenkin's Enys Men. Woo! Anyone who is a fan of this channel will know that I am quite a big fan of Mark Jenkin's Bait, which came out a few years ago. Enys Men is his second feature film, and it shares a lot of stuff with Bait. This time, though it is shot on 16mm with post-sync sound, we have colour. And instead of being a sort of very arty way of doing a kitchen sink British drama, this is taking us to the other British pastime of folk horror movies. And again, anyone who knows me knows that I love a folk horror film. So basically, as soon as they announced that this thing was happening, I was all in. Mary Woodvine stars as the volunteer, as she's credited. A volunteer who has gone to a small island off the Cornish coast to study a flower that appears to be growing on the coast. We assume that this is a rare flower that doesn't appear anywhere else, although we are not specifically told that. She basically goes, records the temperature and looks at it and writes down whether anything is different. She then walks back to her cottage, often dropping a stone into a mine shaft. And she repeats this process for a good few days. And slowly, things start to get stranger. Now, this is not a film in which you are going to be hooked by every single plot twist that is going to come flying at you. There is a story. I'm not 100% sure what was going on, but there is a story, and I think it's one of those films that the more times you watch it, you will piece together a bit more of an idea of what is happening in the film. But on a first watch, it's very much a tone poem with a bit of a plot. You are mainly experiencing these events that are happening that feel surreal. A lot of time things feel like they could be a memory or they could not be a memory. They could be ghosts. There's a lot of characters cross the volunteer's path, but it's never 100% clear whether they're crossing her path literally there, then, or if she's remembering a time that she saw them elsewhere. It's unclear whether she's been to this island before. So much of it feels left up to the audience to determine what's happening. There is so much of it that feels like it's one way when you watch it, like at the start of the film, and then you go, hang on, what is that there? Are we seeing time in a straight line, or are events happening out of chronological order? It's very strange, and I think that's going to piss off a lot of people. But I found it really engaging because I was never 100% sure what was going to happen next, or necessarily what has already happened.
Are you lonely? Not really. Are you there?
Now, this is not a film that is easy to talk about the performances in. Woodvine spends a lot of time on screen on her own, trekking along this sort of blasted plain outside of her cottage, or on a cliff looking at a flower. And of course, it's all made stranger by the fact that all of the dialogue is post-synced and was recorded well after filming, and that feels less important in Enys Men. Enys Men is much more about the watching and the visuals, whereas that was a huge part of Jenkin's Bait. But that had a lot of conversations, and it felt like the post-sync sound was a really interesting thing, and it felt like it was really prominent. You aren't going to be watching this and noticing the post-syncedness nearly as much, or at least I found that I wasn't. Which I guess is good, because it's not distracting, but it felt like such a key part of Bait that isn't really a part of this one. So that leaves us predominantly with the cinematography to help us understand the story and to convey the meaning of the story and the tone and all of that shiz. Thankfully, the film is fucking gorgeous. It's shot on 16mm film. I don't know whether this is hand processed by Jenkin as the black and white was. I would probably assume so. Assume so? What? But, yeah. It's very much... It's got that very... So much of the joy of the film is in that film stock. You would not get the same experience by seeing this digital or on 35. The fact that it's... The texture of the film is so amazing. Because it's all these rural environments and all of the, your cliff sides, it's rugged and you've got shots of the sea. It really feels like you could reach out and touch it. It's got such an immersive quality, despite the fact that the film, the stock, the grain is so obvious. It pulls you in because it just feels right. It feels connected to the landscape. It doesn't feel like a creative decision that was made because film's cool. It works. And I love how the colours look in this film. It's just got such a... Like, the volunteer wears this red, Mac throughout most of it. And it's just got such a pop to it. And the way that the sky is often just white out and this red popping against it is... There is such an understanding of whatever film stock was used. And there are times at which you can even go, well, I can tell this was filmed on a separate reel to one of the others because it's got something slightly different about it. And the fact that you can actually notice that is really interesting as someone who adores film. But it is shot incredibly, incredibly well. There are moments of slow motion, often when the rocks are being dropped down into the mines, or shots of the sea in slow motion, and they look amazing and really add an atmosphere, especially when paired with the score, which I'll talk about later. It's beautiful and yet so eerie. There are a lot of zooms. We know I love a zoom. The film often gets very, very close in on things. Jenkin uses a lot of cutaways. The editing is fantastic. Often this is what alludes to this idea that you don't understand if time is 100% chronological or if memories are happening, because you will often cut around, and the editing is... You could write a thesis on the editing in this. It's fantastic. But yeah, you get a lot of these cutaways to just objects in the cottage, or to parts of the landscape. And I know on Bait, and I'm assuming it's the same here, Jenkin would just be like, okay, I've only got 10 seconds left of this reel of film, let's just get a shot of this item. And the way that these cutaways are brought into the film is just... It adds so... It makes the film so immersive. Also, Jenkin repeats a lot of images. There's shots of a foot on a step that you see over and over again. It's got this ritual element to it. It's got this element of it's got this... It feels like the character has to repeat these steps, and it plays into again that theme that is time repeating, is time consistent. the sound that is in Enys Men is just as important to the atmosphere as all of the visual stuff. Yes, the post-synced dialogue is less obvious within this film compared to Bait, but the rest of the sound is just as intense and immersive. The way that the sounds of the sea, the sounds of nature are brought in, it adds this very immersive quality to it. British wildlife makes really weird noises, and I think that is carried over really nicely. A lot of the dialogue in this is done over radio, and the sort of beep of the radio when it starts out as somewhat comforting and becomes more startling as the film goes on. And then there is the soundtrack, which is once again all analogue synth sounds. But whereas in Bait, the soundtrack feels it has this repetitive, it sort of comes in waves and it feels like the sea. Here, it's much more sort of these higher toned, sort of droning qualities that have there is much more of an element of the wind. I think, yes, there is the sea, but it feels like so much more of this film revolves around the wind and being on top of this very flat plain, and there is a prominent tree that is used to sort of give you a reference point as items begin to move and change, and this tree stays in place, but it's a tree that's been blasted by the wind and is at like a very acute angle to the ground. And it's the way the soundtrack has been created almost has this like wind through a broken window quality, and it feels beautiful, but it feels threatening and ominous. And the more times all it takes is for the tiniest little bit of a lower note to come in, and everything feels so much more threatening and darker. And there's a point at which a small rhythm develops, but then it starts to play out of time and overlap with itself, and it's just, again, it's got this memory falling apart, time falling apart, because it's overlapping. And the film has this very unsettling nature. It reminds me quite a lot of Skinamarink that came out earlier this year, in that you could sit without the picture with headphones on and have an equally interesting experience. There's a certain ASMR quality that it feels like, especially even that there's a vague hiss from the sound, sort of an optical track quality to it. It envelops you in a world. And like I said, I had heard the soundtrack long before seeing the film, and it created this, it told the story in and of itself. And I think the entire sound design would work in a sort of radio play format.
Hello? Hello?
I think we're in a very interesting place with a lot of British film in general and British horror. This is not a terrifying film. Don't go into this expecting to be scared. But it is unsettling and eerie. But I do think it's very interesting to see how much British cinema, especially independent British horror, is starting to take its inspiration. It feels like its inspiration is coming certainly a lot less from outside, but I think that's been something we've been noticing for quite a few years. For the past 15 years, we've regained a sort of British identity in horror, But it really feels like we're starting to see a lot more influence come from telly, notably like your BBC dramas from the late 60s through the 70s. Enys Men sits really nicely alongside films like Possum and In the Earth, in that it feels like a lost episode of Doctor Who, or that it could have run directly after The Stone Tape or one of the Ghost Stories for Christmas. If Tom Baker or John Pertwee were walking past the volunteer in this film, you would not bat an eyelid. It would feel right. And this probably has the closest, because it has the visual aesthetic, the 16mm quality to it. But I think that's really interesting, and I think it's that there's that very much that element that this is a folk horror film, and there are moments that, you know, do hearken to something like The Wicker Man. There is a little musical sequence, in fact, that, you know, that's where that comes from. But it also feels like, because you have this small science moment, you don't actually... I was waiting for the film to tip into almost science fiction slightly, because I think something British TV did really well back in the day is that mixture between science fiction and horror, and I think this plays in on that just enough, and I think that is becoming much more prevalent. I think that is the distinct voice of British horror at the moment. I currently don't think that Enys Men is as special as Bait is. I think Bait really is one of the best British films ever made. I'm not 100% sure whether Enys Men surpasses it at this point, but I do also realise that I've seen Bait many more times, and I think Enys Men is a film that is going to improve over time. I think the more times you see it, the more the layers are going to peel away, and the more understanding you are going to get. You're going to understand the reminders that turn up. What do they mean? You're going to understand the timing of it, what is actually happening. I think the beauty of the shots is only going to become more and more interesting the more time you can spend looking at them. The religious elements of it, the ghostly elements of it, I think are only going to intensify upon watch after watch after watch. So it is not going to be a film for everyone, because, as I said, it is about tone, it is about letting the film wash over you and accepting that it's not got it's got answers, but you need to find them. It's not going to tell them to you. It is a film that is quite happy to simply exist and let you do the work. But it is beautiful and distinct. I have not seen another film like it, because even though it shares so much with Bates, it is a very different film. It does not feel like Mark Jenkin has just gone, well, Bait was great, let's do that again. Because this is much more of a genre picture, and it is a work of art. And I do think he's one of the most interesting voices in British cinema, and I can't wait to see what comes next. And I can't wait to watch Enys Men again. But that is just what I thought. Let me know down in the comments what you think of Enys Men. Maybe you liked it more than Bait. Let me know down in those comments. Like and subscribe so you don't miss any more videos, and I shall see you next time.